The dust swirled like angry spirits across the parched Wyoming street as Grace Kelly stood frozen on the boardwalk, the whispers cutting through her like shards of glass. "Look at her," the butcher's wife hissed to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. 5 years married and nothing to show for it. Poor Zachary Kelly deserved better than a barren wife. It was 1877, and in the frontier town of Whitethorn, a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore. Grace clutched her market basket tighter, lifting her chin despite the burning shame that colored her cheeks. At 26, she had endured 5 years of monthly disappointments, 5 years of watching other women's bellies swell with life while her own remained stubbornly flat. Mrs. Kelly, the general store owner, Mr. Parsons, greeted her with forced politeness as she entered his establishment. His wife stood behind him, eyes full of judgment. "What can I help you with today? Just some sugar and coffee, please," Grace replied softly, placing her coins on the counter. Her hand trembled slightly, but she refused to show how deeply the town's rejection wounded her. Mr. Parsons nodded, measuring out her purchases with mechanical efficiency. "Heard your husband's taking on extra shifts at the mine, working himself to the bone, that man." The implication hung in the air. What else did Zachary have to live for with no children to provide for? Grace accepted her packages with a tight smile and hurried out, desperate to escape the suffocating pity and condemnation that followed her everywhere in Whitethorn. The walk home to her small cabin on the edge of town was mercifully solitary. Grace breathed deeply, allowing the vast Wyoming sky to calm her frayed nerves. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, rugged, beautiful, and untamed. Sometimes she wondered if the wilderness was the only thing in this territory that didn't judge her. She was nearly home when she spotted the crowd gathered outside her cabin. Her steps faltered as dread pooled in her stomach. In the center stood the mine foreman, hat in hand, his expression grim. Grace's basket slipped from her fingers, spilling her purchases into the dust as she broke into a run. "Mrs. Kelly," the foreman said, removing his hat, "there's been an accident at the mine, your husband." The rest of his words faded into a dull roar as Grace's world collapsed around her. Zachary Kelly, her childhood sweetheart and husband of 5 years, was gone, crushed beneath tons of rock in a shaft collapse. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if not for Mrs. Peterson, the midwife, catching her arm. "Poor thing," someone murmured. "No children to comfort her now." "What will become of her?" another voice wondered. "A woman alone." The days that followed passed in a blur of grief. The funeral was small. Zachary had been well liked but had no family besides Grace. She stood alone at the graveside, hollow-eyed and silent, as the preacher spoke words that offered no comfort. "You're welcome to stay with us, dear," Mrs. Peterson offered afterward, maternal concern warring with the same pity Grace had grown to despise. "A woman shouldn't be alone." "Thank you, but I'll manage," Grace replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the emptiness inside her. But managing proved harder than she'd anticipated. With Zachary gone, the cabin and land were hers, but the mine offered only a pittance as compensation for her husband's death. Her small garden provided some food, but winter would come, and with it, expenses she couldn't meet. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mayor Simmons arrived at her door, hat in hand but eyes calculating rather than sympathetic. "Mrs. Kelly, the town council has been discussing your situation." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable yet determined. "With your husband gone and no children to support, we feel the best solution would be for you to sell your property. The Jenkins family is expanding with their 5th child on the way and could make good use of this land." Grace stared at him, stunned by the callousness of his proposal. "This is my home, Mayor Simmons, the home Zachary built for us." "Now, be reasonable," he chided, as if speaking to a child. "What purpose does a childless widow have for a family home? The council is prepared to offer you enough to return east to your family, or perhaps secure a position as a housekeeper in one of the larger homes in town." "I have no family back east," Grace replied, her voice tight with restrained anger, "and this land is mine by right." The mayor's expression hardened. "Mrs. Kelly, without a man's protection or children to raise, your position here is tenuous. People talk. They wonder what deficiency in you prevented you from fulfilling your natural duty as a wife. The council's offer is generous considering your circumstances." Each word struck like a physical blow. Grace gripped the doorframe to steady herself, fighting back tears of rage and humiliation. "I'll need time to consider," she managed finally. "Of course, the council meets again in 2 weeks. We'll expect your answer then." He replaced his hat with a nod. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Kelly, I believe this is best for everyone. A woman without children has little place on the frontier." After he left, Grace sank to the floor, finally allowing her tears to fall. In the span of a month, she had lost her husband and now stood to lose her home all because she had failed to produce a child. The injustice of it burned through her grief, igniting a determination that surprised her with its intensity. "No," she whispered to the empty cabin. "I won't be driven away." The next morning, Grace rose with the sun and surveyed the small plot of land that was hers. The garden needed tending, the chicken coop required repairs, and the roof leaked in 3 places. Zachary had always handled these tasks while she managed the household. Now, everything fell to her. She began with the garden, working from dawn until dusk, pushing her body beyond exhaustion to silence the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. By evening, her hands were blistered and bleeding, but the rows were weeded and new seeds planted. "What do you think you're doing, Mrs. Kelly?" Mrs. Henderson called from the road the following day, watching as Grace struggled to repair the chicken coop. "Maintaining my property," Grace replied without looking up, driving another nail into the wood with more force than necessary. "That's men's work," Mrs. Henderson said, scandalized. "You should hire someone, or better yet, accept the council's offer. Everyone's talking about it. They say it's the sensible thing to do." "I'm sure they do." Grace finally looked up, meeting the other woman's gaze steadily. "Please tell them I'm perfectly capable of determining what's sensible for my own life." Word of Grace's defiance spread through Whitethorn like wildfire. Some admired her spirit, but most viewed her efforts with skepticism or outright derision. A woman alone, especially one who had failed in her primary duty of motherhood, was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of frontier life. As the days passed, Grace's isolation grew. Merchants were less willing to extend credit, neighbors stopped visiting, and the preacher's sermons began to feature pointed references to women's proper roles and the divine purpose of childbearing. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had initially shown kindness, grew distant, uncomfortable with Grace's refusal to conform to expectations. The night before the council meeting, Grace sat alone at her table, staring at the meager coins she had managed to save. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, to maintain the property through winter, let alone make improvements. Her body ached from unaccustomed labor, and her heart ached with loneliness and the constant, gnawing fear of failure. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider accepting the council's offer. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps there was no place here for a barren widow who refused to know her place. A sudden pounding at her door startled her from her thoughts. Grace approached cautiously. Visitors after dark were rare, especially for a woman living alone. "Who's there?" she called, one hand on the shotgun Zachary had taught her to use for emergencies. "Madam, I apologize for the late hour," a deep voice responded. "Name's Vaughn Jameson. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back and I saw your light. I don't mean to trouble you, but I could use some water and directions to town." Grace hesitated, then unbolted the door, keeping the shotgun visible as she opened it a crack. Standing on her porch was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped back respectfully when he saw the weapon, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "I understand your caution, madam," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "I'd be happy to wait out here while you fetch the water, if that would make you more comfortable." Something in his manner, the careful respect, the lack of presumption, eased Grace's wariness slightly. She nodded, leaving the door ajar as she went to fetch water from the kitchen pump. When she returned, she got her first clear look at Vaughn Jameson in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin, intelligent hazel eyes, and a face that, while not conventionally handsome, held a quiet strength that made it compelling. His clothes were dusty from the trail but of good quality. "Thank you kindly," he said, accepting the dipper of water with a nod. "Been a long day's ride." "Whitethorn's about a mile east," Grace informed him, gesturing down the road. "The Golden Spur Inn has rooms, though they're basic." Vaughn nodded, handing back the empty dipper. "I appreciate it, Mrs. Kelly, Grace Kelly, Mrs. Kelly." He tipped his hat respectfully. "I won't take up more of your evening." As he turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind swept across the property, sending a loose section of roof shingle clattering to the ground near the porch steps. Vaughn glanced up, eyes narrowing as he assessed the damage. "Pardon my saying so, madam, but that roof's in rough shape." Storm coming in could cause real trouble. Grace's shoulders stiffened. "I'm aware, Mr. Jameson, I'll handle it." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended because Vaughn studied her face for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying. "I've got some experience with roofing," he said finally. "I'd be happy to take a look tomorrow if you'd allow it, in exchange for the water and directions." "That's not necessary," Grace replied automatically, the defensiveness that had become her shield rising swiftly. "I don't need charity." "Not offering charity, Mrs. Kelly," Vaughn responded mildly. "Just an exchange of favors between neighbors, temporary as that might be." Before Grace could refuse again, a distant rumble of thunder punctuated his words. They both glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming faster than I thought," Vaughn observed. "I don't suppose there's a stable or barn where I might shelter my horse until it passes. I'd pay for the trouble, of course." Grace hesitated, torn between ingrained hospitality and hard-earned caution. Finally, practicality won out. "The barn's around back. It's small but sound. You can wait out the storm there." Relief crossed his features. "Much obliged. I won't disturb you further." As he led his horse toward the barn, Grace closed and bolted her door, wondering if she'd made a mistake. Strangers couldn't be trusted easily in the territories, especially by a woman alone. Yet something about Vaughn Jameson's manner had seemed genuine, lacking the judgment or predatory interest she'd come to expect. The storm broke with sudden fury, rain lashing against the cabin and wind howling through the damaged sections of roof. Grace placed buckets under the worst leaks and tried to ignore the growing puddles on her floor. Tomorrow she would face the council and their ultimatum. Tonight she would endure one more trial in a long series of them. A particularly violent gust of wind tore another section of shingle free, and water began to pour in through a new opening. Grace dragged her trunk beneath it, but the deluge quickly overwhelmed the makeshift barrier. She was searching for another container when a knock sounded at her door again. Vaughn stood on her porch, rain-soaked and holding his bedroll above his head as minimal protection. "Mrs. Kelly, I don't mean to intrude, but I can hear your roof coming apart from the barn. If you've got tools, I might be able to secure it temporarily before the whole thing goes." Grace stared at him, measuring his sincerity against her need and finding the latter greater. "There are tools in the shed beside the barn." 10 minutes later, Vaughn was on her roof in the pouring rain, hammering loose shingles back into place while Grace held a lantern from the relative shelter of the porch. By the time he climbed down, the worst of the leaks were patched, though both of them were drenched. "It's not pretty, but it'll hold until morning," he said, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "That's when you can get a proper look at the damage." "Thank you," Grace said, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "You didn't have to do that," Vaughn shrugged, seemed the neighborly thing. A violent shiver racked Grace's frame, her thin dress soaked through from the rain and the earlier leaks. Concern crossed Vaughn's features. "You need to get warm, Mrs. Kelly. I'll return to the barn." "Wait," Grace found herself saying. "There's coffee on the stove." "Least I can do is offer you a hot drink before you go back out in this weather." It was the first time in weeks she had invited anyone into her home, and as Vaughn followed her inside, removing his hat and leaving his muddy boots by the door without being asked, Grace felt strangely vulnerable. The cabin was small and modest, but it had been a happy home once. Now it felt like the last fortress of her independence, threatened from all sides. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the wood stove, adding an extra log to build up the heat. Vaughn accepted his cup gratefully, standing respectfully by the door rather than making himself comfortable. "Been on your own long?" he asked after a moment, the question gentle rather than prying. "My husband died a month ago, mining accident." The words still hurt to say, but the sharp edge of grief had begun to dull to a persistent ache. "I'm sorry for your loss," Vaughn said, and unlike the hollow condolences of the townspeople, his words held genuine sympathy without the undercurrent of judgment. "It's a hard country for anyone alone." "The town council thinks it's especially hard for a woman," Grace found herself saying, bitterness creeping into her tone. "They're meeting tomorrow to discuss my future, whether I should be allowed to keep my own property or be forced to sell to a proper family." Vaughn's brows drew together. "They can't legally force you to sell if the deed's in your name. They can make it impossible for me to stay," Grace replied. "Credit denied, services refused. It's already begun. A woman without a husband or children has no place here, according to them." Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes. "That's why you were so determined to fix everything yourself. You're trying to prove you can manage alone." "I have to," Grace said simply. "This is my home, the only thing I have left." Vaughn nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. "What will you tell them tomorrow?" "I don't know." Grace stared into her cup. "The practical choice would be to accept their offer and leave, but something in me can't bear to surrender what Zachary and I built together, to admit they're right about me being insufficient." Her voice caught on the last word. "There's nothing insufficient about fighting for what's yours," Vaughn observed quietly. "That takes a special kind of courage." They fell silent, the storm raging outside while an unexpected comfort grew in the small space between them. When Vaughn finally set down his empty cup, Grace found herself reluctant for him to leave. "The spare room is small, but it's dry," she offered, surprising herself. "No sense in you sleeping in a drafty barn tonight." "I wouldn't want to impose or cause talk that might make your situation worse," Vaughn said carefully. "The talk can hardly get worse," Grace replied with a trace of dark humor. "And it's just a practical arrangement for one night." After a moment's consideration, Vaughn nodded. "Then I accept with thanks, and if you're agreeable, I'd like to properly repair that roof in the morning before your meeting with the council." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Jameson." "Vaughn, please," he corrected, "and it's not about owing. Sometimes folks just help each other because they can." The simple statement struck Grace deeply after weeks of conditional offers and thinly veiled judgments. She showed him to the spare room, provided a towel and clean blankets, and retreated to her own bedroom feeling strangely unsettled, not by fear, but by the unexpected kindness from a stranger when those she had considered friends had turned their backs. Morning brought clear skies and the sound of hammering that woke Grace from the first restful sleep she'd had in weeks. She dressed quickly and went outside to find Vaughn already on the roof, efficiently replacing damaged shingles with materials he must have brought from his own supplies. "You didn't need to start so early," she called up to him. Vaughn paused in his work. "Figured you'd want this sorted before your meeting. What time are you due in town?" "Noon," Grace replied, checking the position of the sun. "But really, you've done more than enough already." "Almost finished," he assured her. Returning to his task with practiced efficiency, by mid-morning the roof was repaired, and Vaughn had moved on to fixing the chicken coop more thoroughly than Grace's hasty patches had managed. She brought him water and watched, fascinated by the competent way he worked, handling tools with the ease of long practice. "Have you been a carpenter long?" she asked as he secured the last board. "No, madam," Vaughn replied with a small smile. "Just grew up having to fix whatever broke. My pa believed every man should know how to work with his hands, whether he needed to or not." "He sounds wise." "He was." Vaughn straightened, wiping his brow. "Taught me that a person's worth isn't in what they own or what others think of them, but in how they face what life gives them, good or bad." The words resonated deeply with Grace. "I wish the town council shared that philosophy." Vaughn studied her thoughtfully. "Mind if I ask why you don't just tell them about the repairs? Show them you're managing fine on your own." "They wouldn't believe me," Grace replied, frustration evident in her voice. "They'd assume I hired help, or that these are temporary fixes that will fall apart by winter." In their eyes, I'm deficient not just as a woman who couldn't give her husband children, but as a human being who dares to believe she has value beyond that failure. That's not a failure, Vaughn said firmly, surprising her with his vehemence. And it sure as hell doesn't determine your worth. The conviction in his voice momentarily stunned Grace. For 5 years, she had lived with the weight of her supposed inadequacy, had seen it reflected in pitying glances and whispered conversations. To hear someone, especially a man, declare so forcefully that it wasn't a failing shook something loose inside her. I should get ready for the meeting, she said finally, retreating from emotions too raw to examine. Thank you again for your help, Vaughn nodded, respecting her need for space. I'll tend to my horse and be on my way soon. Grace prepared for the council meeting with grim determination, donning her best dress, the one she had worn to church, before the congregants' sideways glances became too much to bear. She pinned her hair neatly and practiced maintaining a dignified expression despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. When she emerged from her bedroom, Vaughn was standing by the door, hat in hand, clearly prepared to depart. I want to thank you properly for your hospitality, Mrs. Kelly, he said formally, and wish you luck with the council. Thank you, Grace replied, suddenly reluctant to see him go. In the short time since his arrival, Vaughn Jameson had shown her more respect and kindness than she had received from people who had known her for years. Will you be staying in Whitethorn long? That depends, he said thoughtfully. I came to look into some business opportunities. Might be worth sticking around a while if things look promising. Grace nodded, trying to ignore the small flicker of hope that his words ignited. Well, safe travels, Mr. Jameson, Vaughn, and thank you again. Actually, he said, replacing his hat, if you don't mind the company, I'm headed into town myself. Thought I might walk with you if that's agreeable. Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd appreciate that. They walked side by side down the dusty road to Whitethorn, Vaughn leading his horse and adjusting his pace to match Grace's shorter stride. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on his travels, her life before Wyoming, and the challenges of frontier living. For the first time in months, Grace found herself laughing at his wry observations about territorial politics and the peculiarities of different towns he'd visited. As they reached the outskirts of Whitethorn, however, Grace's mood sobered. The easy camaraderie of the walk would soon be replaced by the judgment and scrutiny that awaited her. The council meets at the town hall, she said, gesturing to the modest building ahead. I should go in alone. Vaughn nodded, understanding. I'll be around if you need anything afterward. His simple offer of support steadied Grace as she walked the final distance to the town hall, conscious of the stairs following her progress through the main street. She held her head high, focusing on the unexpected strength she had discovered in herself over the past weeks, rather than the doubt that had been her constant companion for years. The council members were already assembled when she entered Mayor Simmons, Mr. Parsons' doctor. Whitfield and 2 prominent ranchers whose properties bordered Whitethorn, all men, all regarding her with expressions ranging from impatience to condescension. Mrs. Kelly, the mayor greeted her, prompt as always, please be seated. Grace took the lone chair positioned before the council table, feeling like a defendant awaiting judgment. In many ways, she supposed she was. As you know, Mayor Simmons began without preamble, we've convened to discuss your situation following Mr. Kelly's unfortunate passing. The council has reviewed the circumstances and maintains that the most beneficial arrangement for all parties would be for you to sell your property to the Jenkins family. They're prepared to offer a fair price that would allow you to resettle elsewhere or secure suitable employment. I appreciate the council's concern, Grace replied evenly, but I have no intention of selling my home. The property belongs to me legally and I am managing it adequately. Mayor Simmons exchanged glances with the other council members. Mrs. Kelly, while the deed is indeed in your name, the practical considerations cannot be ignored. A woman alone cannot maintain a homestead properly. It's simply not natural. With all due respect, Mayor, Grace countered, there's nothing in the law that says a woman can't own property or manage her affairs independently. My home is well maintained, my garden is productive, and I have no debts in town. Only because your credit has been limited, Mr. Parsons interjected. As winter approaches, your situation will become more precarious. We're trying to prevent hardship, not cause it. Your concern is noted, Grace said, struggling to maintain her composure. But my decision stands. I will not sell my property. Dr. Whitfield leaned forward, his expression sympathetically patronizing. Mrs. Kelly, we understand this is difficult. Grief can cloud judgment, but you must consider your future. Without children to provide for or protect, what purpose does maintaining that homestead serve? The familiar pain twisted in Grace's chest at the reminder of her childlessness, but she forced herself to meet the doctor's gaze steadily. My purpose, Dr. Whitfield, is to live my life as I choose. I don't require children to justify my existence or my property ownership. A shocked murmur ran through the council at her forthright response. Women in Whitethorn simply didn't speak this way, especially not to men of standing. Mayor Simmons cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Mrs. Kelly, no one is questioning your right to exist, but the reality of frontier life is that certain arrangements are more practical than others. The council believes. The door to the town hall opened abruptly, cutting off the mayor's speech. Every head turned as Vaughn Jameson entered, removing his hat as he stepped into the room. Pardon the interruption, gentlemen, he said, nodding respectfully to the council before turning to Grace with a warm smile. Mrs. Kelly, I apologize for being late. Grace stared at him in confusion as he crossed to stand beside her chair, his presence solid and reassuring. Sir, this is a closed council meeting, Mayor Simmons protested. I'm afraid I must ask you to leave. I understand, Mayor, Vaughn replied smoothly, but as I have a direct interest in the matter being discussed, I believe I should be permitted to stay. The mayor frowned. And what interest would that be, Mr. Jameson, Vaughn Jameson? He placed a hand lightly on the back of Grace's chair. I'm Grace Kelly's business partner. Grace barely managed to conceal her shock as Vaughn continued with perfect confidence. Mrs. Kelly and I have entered into an arrangement regarding her property. I'm providing capital and labor for improvements while she contributes the land and her considerable skills in agriculture. We're developing a small horse breeding operation specializing in quality stock for the cavalry and stagecoach companies. The council members exchanged confused glances. This is the first we've heard of such an arrangement, Mayor Simmons said skeptically. We finalized the details only yesterday, Vaughn explained. I've been traveling through the territory assessing business opportunities and found Mrs. Kelly's property ideal for our purposes. The soil quality, water access, and proximity to town make it particularly valuable. I see, the mayor said slowly, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected development. And this is a purely business arrangement. The implication was clear, and Grace felt a flush of anger rise to her cheeks. Before she could respond, Vaughn spoke again, his tone cooling noticeably. It is a legitimate business partnership between two adults, Mayor. I'm surprised you would suggest otherwise about a lady of Mrs. Kelly's standing in the community. The rebuke, delivered with such calm authority, left the mayor backpedaling. Of course, I meant no disrespect. It's simply unusual, you understand. Progress often is, Vaughn replied. Now, I understand the council was discussing Mrs. Kelly's property. Given this new information, I trust there are no further concerns about its management or her ability to maintain it. The council members conferred in hushed tones before Mayor Simmons addressed them again, his manner considerably more respectful. While this development is unexpected, it does appear to address our primary concerns. However, Mr. Jameson, I would advise formalizing this partnership legally to prevent any misunderstandings in the future. Already in progress, Mayor, Vaughn assured him. We've drafted the necessary documents and will be filing them with the territorial offices in Cheyenne next week. Well then, Mayor Simmons concluded, clearly eager to end a meeting that had veered so far from his expectations. I believe our business here is concluded. Mrs. Kelly, Mr. Jameson, good day to you both. Grace rose on slightly unsteady legs, amazed at how quickly the council's authority had crumbled in the face of Vaughn's confident intervention. He offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and she took it, allowing him to escort her from the town hall. Neither spoke until they were well away from the building, walking toward the main street. Finally, Grace found her voice. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Lie to the council on my behalf." "Who says I was lying?" Vaughn replied, his expression serious. "I've been looking for a good investment opportunity. Your land is promising, and you clearly have the determination to make something of it. I'd be honored if you'd consider a genuine partnership." Grace stopped walking, staring at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you've faced loss and judgment with dignity. I know you're willing to work harder than most men I've met to protect what's yours. And I know that a woman who stands her ground against an entire town council has exactly the kind of spirit I want in a business partner." "And if I refuse?" Grace asked, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. "Then I'll wish you well and be on my way," Vaughn said without hesitation. "The choice is entirely yours, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it with respect rather than condescension, with admiration rather than pity made her heart beat faster. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she pressed. Vaughn considered her question thoughtfully. "My mother was widowed young with 4 children to raise. Everyone told her to remarry or surrender the ranch my father had built. Instead, she learned to run it herself, better than most men could have. But she nearly lost everything because no one would do business with a woman alone." His eyes held Grace's steadily. "I swore I'd never be the kind of man who judges someone's worth by anything other than their character." Grace felt the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart begin to crumble under the weight of his sincerity. "I need time to think about this." "Of course," Vaughn agreed easily. "I'll be staying at the Golden Spur for a few days. Take all the time you need." They walked together to the general store where Grace intended to purchase supplies with a newfound confidence. The whispers still followed them, but they seemed to have lost their power to wound her. Vaughn's presence beside her, respectful but not possessive, offered a shield against the town's judgment without diminishing her independence. As they approached the store, Mrs. Henderson emerged, nearly colliding with them. Her eyes widened at the sight of Grace with a strange man, and speculation instantly animated her features. "Mrs. Kelly," she greeted, curiosity practically radiating from her. "I didn't expect to see you in town today, Mrs. Henderson," Grace replied evenly. "I had business with the council. This is Mr. Jameson, a business associate." Vaughn tipped his hat politely. "Madam." Mrs. Henderson's gaze darted between them, hungry for gossip. "Business, you say? How interesting." "And what sort of business brings you to our little town, Mr. Jameson?" "Horse breeding," Vaughn replied pleasantly. "Mrs. Kelly and I are establishing an operation on her property. If you'll excuse us, we have some purchases to make." He guided Grace past the astonished woman and into the store, where Mr. Parsons' expression shifted from habitual condescension to wary respect upon seeing Vaughn at her side. "Mrs. Kelly, Mr. Jameson," he greeted, his manner markedly different from the council meeting. "What can I help you with today?" "I need supplies," Grace stated, handing over her list with newfound confidence. "And I'd like to discuss reopening a line of credit for the business." As Mr. Parsons scrambled to accommodate her requests, Grace caught Vaughn watching her with undisguised admiration. She returned his smile, feeling something warm and unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, not just gratitude, but a connection that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. The next few days established a pattern that soon became the talk of Whitethorn. Vaughn rented a wagon and began hauling lumber and supplies to Grace's property. Together, they repaired outbuildings, expanded the chicken coop, and laid the groundwork for proper stables. News of their partnership spread quickly, transforming Grace's position in the community almost overnight. Where once there had been judgment and pity, now there was curiosity and grudging respect. "It's remarkable how quickly opinions change," Grace observed one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset after a long day of work. Yesterday, Mrs. Peterson invited me to her daughter's wedding, the same woman who couldn't meet my eyes at Zachary's funeral. Vaughn leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs before him. People respect strength and success. They're starting to see both in you. Thanks to you, Grace acknowledged. I'd still be fighting the council alone if you hadn't intervened. I just provided an opportunity, Vaughn corrected. You're the one who seized it. That took courage. The quiet admiration in his voice warmed her more than the evening sun. Over the past week, Grace had found herself increasingly drawn to Vaughn's steady presence, his thoughtful conversation, and the respect with which he treated her opinions and decisions. He never presumed to take charge of their project, instead consulting her on each step and valuing her knowledge of the land. "Have you decided," he asked after a comfortable silence, "about the partnership? The official papers will need filing soon if we're to keep the council satisfied." Grace had been considering his offer carefully. The business arrangement made sense. She had land but limited capital, while Vaughn had savings from his years working cattle drives and a knowledge of horses that complemented her gardening skills. Together, they could build something neither could achieve alone, but it wasn't just the practical aspects that occupied her thoughts. It was the way her heart lifted when Vaughn appeared each morning, the comfort of their conversations, and the growing awareness that her feelings for him had progressed far beyond gratitude or friendship. "I've decided to accept," she said finally, "on one condition. Name it." "Complete honesty between us always." Grace met his gaze directly. "No matter what happens with the business, I need to know I can trust you." Vaughn nodded solemnly. "You have my word." He hesitated, then added, "In the spirit of honesty, there's something I should tell you." Grace braced herself, wondering if her instincts about him had been wrong after all. "I didn't come to Whitethorn by accident," Vaughn admitted. "I was following up on a letter from Zachary Kelly." Grace stared at him in shock. "Zachary wrote to you, but how? Why?" "We served together briefly during the war," Vaughn explained. "Lost touch afterward, but he tracked me down through mutual acquaintances about 6 months ago. He knew about my experience with horses and was looking for a partner to expand your property into breeding stock." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded, well-worn letter. "This arrived just before news of his death. I came to pay my respects and see if there was anything I could do for his widow." Grace accepted the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Zachary's handwriting immediately. The pages detailed his hopes for the property, his admiration for Vaughn's character and expertise, and most surprisingly, his pride in his wife's strength and determination. "He believed in you," Vaughn said softly as Grace read. "Said you were the bravest woman he'd ever known, facing down disappointment month after month but never losing hope." Tears blurred Grace's vision as she came to the final paragraphs. "The doctors say we may never have children of our own, but that hasn't diminished my love for Grace. She's worth the whole world to me, Vaughn, though this town can't see past their narrow judgments. I want to build something that's ours, something that will give her the security and respect she deserves if anything should happen to me. I trust you to see her true value, friend. It's why I'm writing to you instead of a dozen other men I know with horse sense." Grace pressed the letter to her heart, overwhelmed by the evidence of Zachary's love and foresight. "He never told me he was writing to you, never let on that he was worried about leaving me alone." "He wanted to surprise you," Vaughn said gently. "Said you'd been disappointed enough and deserved something to look forward to. And you came even knowing he was gone," Grace whispered. "Why? Because of how he wrote about you," Vaughn admitted. "I wanted to meet the woman who inspired such devotion." His eyes held hers steadily. "And every day since, I've understood more why he felt that way." The simple honesty of his words broke something open in Grace's heart, not the pain of loss, but the possibility of new beginnings. She had loved Zachary deeply and would always honor his memory. But life continued, and with it came the chance for new connections, new purposes, new joys. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "for honoring his wishes and your own integrity." Vaughn nodded, seeming relieved by her response. "So the partnership stands, with our condition of honesty?" "Yes," Grace agreed, a smile touching her lips. "Partners." The The following weeks saw their business partnership formalized and their personal relationship deepen with natural ease. Grace found herself laughing more, dreaming again of possibilities rather than merely surviving. Vaughn's presence in her life brought not just practical assistance, but a companionship that filled the lonely spaces grief had carved into her days. The town's attitude continued to evolve as the horse breeding operation took shape. When the first quality mares arrived, purchased from Vaughn's connections in Texas, even Mayor Simmons stopped by to admire them and offer belated congratulations on their enterprise. Mrs. Peterson invited Grace to rejoin the Women's Aid Society, though Grace politely declined, preferring to spend her limited free time on pursuits of her own choosing. 3 months after Vaughn's arrival in Whitethorn, they delivered their first foal, a strong colt with excellent bloodlines that promised to bring a handsome price when trained. Standing together in the new stable as the wobbly-legged creature nursed from its mother, Grace felt a sense of accomplishment and joy that had been absent for too long. "He's perfect," she whispered, leaning unconsciously against Vaughn's side. "She picked a good time," Vaughn agreed, his arm slipping naturally around Grace's waist. "Just in time for your birthday tomorrow." Grace looked up at him in surprise. "How did you know it was my birthday?" Zachary mentioned it in his letter, Vaughn admitted with a smile. "Said you never made a fuss about it, but he always tried to mark the occasion somehow." The thoughtfulness of both men, one gone but not forgotten, one present and increasingly dear, filled Grace with warmth. "Just being here, seeing this new life begin on our land, that's celebration enough." Vaughn's expression grew serious as he turned to face her fully. "Grace, these past months working beside you have been the most fulfilling of my life. I came here out of respect for Zachary and curiosity about you. I've stayed because I can't imagine being anywhere you're not." Grace's heart quickened at the depth of emotion in his voice. "Vaughn, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's soon, and I know Zachary will always hold a special place in your heart, as he should. But I've grown to care for you deeply, not just as a partner or friend, but as a woman of extraordinary courage and grace." He took her hands in his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not asking for promises yet, just for permission to court you properly if you feel anything similar for me." Grace didn't hesitate. "I do," she said simply. "More than I thought possible again." The joy that illuminated Vaughn's features at her words made him almost boyish, erasing the lines that experience had etched around his eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he lowered his head and kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that held both passion and reverence. When they parted, Grace felt as though something long dormant within her had awakened, stretching toward the warmth and light Vaughn had brought into her life. "I should warn you," she said, a teasing note entering her voice. "The town will be scandalized. They've only just accepted me as a business partner. A courtship might be too much for Whitethorn to bear." Vaughn laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet stable. "Let them talk. They've been wrong about your worth from the beginning." 6 months later, as winter gave way to spring, Grace stood with Vaughn before the preacher in a simple ceremony attended by the handful of Whitethorn residents who had truly come to respect their partnership. Mrs. Peterson wept openly, having become a genuine friend after finally seeing past her own preconceptions. Even Mayor Simmons attended, though his wife still sniffed disapprovingly at what she considered a hasty remarriage. Grace wore a new blue dress rather than traditional white, honoring the fact that this was a second beginning rather than a first. Zachary's memory was honored with a small locket containing his picture that Grace wore around her neck, a symbol that Vaughn had encouraged, understanding that love wasn't diminished by acknowledging what came before. As they spoke their vows, promising to cherish and respect each other through whatever life brought, Grace felt a sense of coming full circle. She had lost so much, endured judgment and rejection, fought for her place and her dignity. Now she stood beside a man who saw her completely and valued all that she was: her strength, her determination, her capacity for love that transcended society's narrow definitions of womanhood. "I promise to see your worth every day," Vaughn added to the traditional vows, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. Not for what the world says a woman should be, but for who you are in your heart and soul. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a testament to the journey that had brought them together, one of loss and resilience, unexpected connections, and second chances. The celebration afterward at their homestead, now thriving with expanded gardens and a growing herd of quality horses, brought together the unlikely community they had built around themselves. Ranch hands hired from nearby properties, traders who had become regular customers, and the few townspeople who had overcome their prejudices to recognize Grace's true character. As twilight descended, Vaughn found Grace standing alone on the porch, watching their guests laugh and talk around the bonfire in the yard. "Any regrets, Mrs. Jameson?" he asked, joining her with 2 cups of cider. "Not one," Grace replied, accepting the drink and leaning against his solid presence. "Though I still can't believe how much has changed in a year." "You changed it," Vaughn said with conviction, "by refusing to accept their judgment, by fighting for your place." "I just had the good fortune to witness it," Grace smiled, touched by his persistent belief in her strength. "We changed it together, partners in all things now." Vaughn's arm tightened around her waist. "Always." As they stood watching the stars emerge above their land, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of childlessness remained a tender spot, but it no longer defined her worth or her future. She had found purpose in building something meaningful, love in a partnership of equals, and most importantly, the strength to define her own value in a world that tried to measure women by the narrowest of standards. "They were wrong, you know," Vaughn murmured against her hair. "All of them who called you worthless without a child to show for your marriage. You've always been worth everything to Zachary, to me, and most importantly, to yourself." Grace turned in his arms, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for this second chance at happiness. "We've built a different kind of legacy," she said softly. "One that might help other women see their own worth beyond what society demands." "A worthy legacy indeed," Vaughn agreed, sealing the thought with a kiss that promised many years of partnership, respect, and love that transcended convention. And as they rejoined their guests under the vast Wyoming sky, Grace Kelly Jameson walked with the confidence of a woman who had discovered that her value came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from the courage to define herself on her own terms, worthy not because of what she could produce, but because of who she fundamentally was.